Hello, everybody. What I want to do with this video is take you through a little bit of a process of doing some work with Git, but also the idea of maybe doing some test-driven development to get some of our routes set up. So one of the things that I'm going to do here is that we have this whole idea of this in an e-commerce application where we have the idea of a cart. And the way that I'm going to approach this, and this is going to be a very simplistic implementation of it, is that a cart is strictly going to be an order that has a particular status. And so what I really want to do is I want to create a route where if we end up making this RESTful, what I want to do is to be able to post to a route where I'm looking for an order of a particular type. And when I end up finding that order, what I want to be able to do is I want to say, hey, look, I'm basically looking for a particular user. I'm going to look for an order. I'm going to look for an order that has a status, and I'm going to look for that status to be cart. And if I'm able to find that that order, that's what I'm going to return as my cart. If not, I'm going to want to create it. So that's the direction that I'm going in now. Before even sort of going into a lot of detail on that, one of the things that I want to point out to you is that there's a number of Gulp tasks that are here. Let me just pop this up. You could use these Gulp tasks, but just to sort of take a little bit of magic out with some of these Gulp tasks, the task that I'm going to look at is basically running some server-side tests, because I have some server-side tests that are actually running here. And if I end up running Gulp task and I scroll down here, I should be able to find my, let's see, this is going to be test server. Let's just see if I could find it. So test server JS, this is what I want to run here. And so if I end up doing that here and I say, go over here and I say gulp test server JS, my tests will end up running and all my tests are going to end up passing. A couple of things to really note here. One of them being that you might have to go and set up a testing database, but you'll see an error for that if you don't, because one of the things that's happening in our testing, we're going to use a testing environment, and that's going to end up determining what environment variables end up getting set up here. Now, what I'm going to do is sort of jump ahead a little bit, do a little bit of copying and pasting here to get this to work. Right now I've got server-side test for my members-only route. And if you look at this, what this test is basically doing is saying, hey, look, as an unauthenticated user, if I end up using supertest and I end up creating this agent with this application, and when I try to do a get of API members and I try to call secret stash, I'm going to get a 401. But if I do have a user, and if I do end up posting with that user information, then in fact I'm able to get a response. And one of the things you could always do here too, just as an aside, is if you went over here, and you just wanted to run this particular test, I could do a describe only here. And if I end up running this again, instead of having 12 tests, I should only have 2 tests, those 2 tests. So that might speed things up a little bit. Now what I'm going to do here is, again, I'm not actually even running the application at all. I'm just doing this from a test-driven environment. I'm going to end up copying this file, and I'm going to call this, I'm going to call this my cart test. And I'm going to go into this cart test, and I'm going to describe, I'm going to call this cart route, and I'm going to put an only here just so we can see that this will end up showing up. And if we end up scrolling up here, there's a lot of stuff that pops up here because we expect to get an error, but you'll see it says cart route with an unauthenticated request. Now, what I'm going to modify here a bit is that the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to change my route. And what my route is going to be, so this is kind of an interesting thing, and I'm going to modify this stuff a little bit. What I'm going to end up doing here is that I'm going to go over here and I'm going to specify that if I end up going to this guest agent, and this is going to be a post, and the reason why I want to make this a post is that either this is going to create a card for me or it's going to return an existing card. But in either event, I'm going to end up getting a cart back. And what I expect is that if I end up going over here and I end up going to a post for orders, and what I'm going to do here is that I'm going to, and let me just get my syntax right. What I'm going to end up doing here is that once I end up making a post, I'm going to end up doing a send. And what I'm going to specify here, and again, this is all going to have to be implemented, is that this is going to be for a status of cart. So an order could end up having a status of cart. Again, keep in mind that none of these models end up existing at this point. We're going to end up building them out. But when I end up going to this route and I'm not logged in, what I expect is that I'm going to end up getting a 401 back. And let's just run this and see what kind of errors we end up getting. So I get an error here that says, hey, look, you expected unauthorized, but you actually got a 404 back, meaning that I can't find this route. That's totally accurate. Let's actually go, and we're going to start setting up this route. We're going to sort of work our way down from the router down to the models themselves. And I'm going to go up here to my server. I'm going to look at my app, and I'm going to look in my route. So I've got this members route here. This is a pretty simplistic route. There's this ensure authenticated, which ensures that the request is authenticated. And that's a fancy way of saying that there's no user that's associated with the request. And this is what is the middleware that's ensuring that you don't get the secret stash unless you're logged in. And I'm just going to go ahead and actually copy this. And I'm going to copy it into orders. And if I go down here into orders, and I go over here, this I'm going to modify a little bit. Instead of this being a get, I'm going to make this a post. Now again, my whole thought here in terms of this being RESTful is that when I post to this, and I'm going to end up posting to it, and I'm going to take a look and see that I can, looking at what I'm looking for in terms of a status of cart. If I'm able to find that particular order, I'm going to return it. An order with a status of cart in my application is the cart for that particular user. So what I'm going to do over here is I'm going to put this here just to get this test to pass. And again, this route is not going to be registered unless I end up going in here. And I'm going to specify that I'm going to do use here. And this is going to be orders. And I'm going to end up requiring orders. So now if I end up going back here and running this test, I should end up passing. Now, what's going to be a little bit more interesting here is that if I go back to this cart test, and I want to describe an authenticated request. So what I want to specify here, I'm going to say it should get a 200 response, and I'm going to say with the cart. So what I'm going to end up doing here is that similar to what I ended up doing here, again, I'm going to reuse this code that's here, which is before each. I'm going to be logging in as this user. And here I'm going to go over here and I'm going to specify that this is going to be a post. And this is going to be to API orders. And I'm going to send, and I want to send that this is going to be a status of cart. So that's what I'm going to be sending here. And what do I expect on a response? Well, on a response, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say, hey, look, my cart is really going to be my response.body. And I'm just going to specify, just as a quick setup, that my cart is going to have an ID. So a quick way of just specifying that this ID exists is to say with Mocha that this is going to be okay, which is, again, anything that's truthy. Again, this is going to fail us here if we go to run this again. And the reason why it's going to fail us here is that if you see what we're actually returning here, I ended up just copying and pasting this. And if I go and I look at my orders, I will see that when I post, I'm just returning this stuff back, and there's no ID that's associated with this. If I just wanted to get this to pass, I could, make this up and say, all right, well, here's your cart. I'm going to give it an ID of 5. And I'll go over here and I'll just send back this cart. And if we go back here and we run this, we'll end up getting our test to pass. Now, this is not really what we want to do here. In fact, what we really want to do here, and just to see that we can end up getting some data here, let's just actually do, let's do a console.log, and we'll say request.body, just so we could see that we're actually looking for an order that has a status of cart. And we can see we've got our status of cart that's over here. So what I want to do here is let's go back here. And when we end up posting here, let's make some modifications. First of all, we want to deal with an order. We want to do something like this. We want to say order find one. Okay? Well, what do you want to find? Well, in our case, let's do a where clause, and we're going to do a where clause of request.body. Okay? So again, we're going to assume that we want to be able to find a cart for this particular user. So it's actually not just request.body. And let's actually, I'm going to modify this a little bit. I know we're sending the status, but we'll eventually end up drawing this out a little bit. I'm going to modify this a little bit. So what I'm actually looking for here is a status of cart, and I'm also looking for a user ID, and this is going to be my request.user.id. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually look to find this cart. Now again, this cart doesn't exist, and in fact, order doesn't even exist. But what we would want to do here is we'd want to go and we want to find this cart. This is going to give us a cart. And if we end up finding the cart, I'm just going to say return cart. Otherwise, what I'm going to end up doing here, let's actually do this, say if cart, we're going to return our cart. And if not, what we're going to do is we're going to say order.create. What are we going to create? We're going to create this particular cart that we're looking for. So this is going to have a status of cart, and it's going to have a user ID. And again, this is built in for us already, where we have request.user, and we know that we exist because if we didn't have this, we wouldn't end up making it this far. So if we find our cart from our order that actually doesn't exist yet, we're going to end up using it. In any case, once we end up getting over here, now in this case, we will actually, by all means, have a cart. And we could come down here and we could say response.send this cart back. Now, obviously, this will end up blowing up because we don't have any order. So this is going to not work very well. We've got an internal error here, and we should find order is not defined, which it's not. So how do we go about getting our order? Well, we're going to want to create our order object, and I'm going to do that over here, and I'm going to say order. I actually have to move up 3 levels here. I've got to go, I'm up here in my routes. I've got to go up 1 level to my app. I've got to actually go up to my server, and I'm going to say db models order. Of course, this doesn't exist either. And if I went to run this, I would end up getting another error. And this would specify that it can't find this model. But let's actually go and create this. And again, I'm going to cheat a little bit by going over to server and into DB. And in models, I've got user. And I'm going to copy this. And I'm going to paste it to order.js. And I'm going to simplify it quite a bit. I don't need crypto. I don't need sequelize. This is going to be for an order. The only thing an order is going to have is going to be a status. It's also going to have a user, but this is going to be created with an association. I'm going to just keep these here because they might come in handy later. These are all just going to be empty. And I don't need this over here. The one thing that I do want to do is that I would like to go back to my index here for all of my models. And the same way that my user is here, I want to specify that I'm going to have an order. And I'm also going to want to make a connection to specify that an order belongs to a user. So again, when this ends up syncing at this point, I should end up having an order model, which would make this would end up having a lot more sense. If I go to find one, when I go to post here, I'm going to end up using this status and attach this user ID. Look for an order that has a status of card and a user ID of this logged in user. And if we end up going back here, we go to run this, we'll end up getting this to pass. Now, let's just do a couple of other things with this. So in order to sort of build out this test a little bit, let's do a few other things. Again, I'm just sort of modifying what I have here. One thing that I want to do here is I want to do another test. I want to do another test and specify that the cart's user ID is I want it to be equal some user IDs. Now this user ID doesn't exist yet. Where am I going to end up getting this from? Well, what I'm going to do up here is I'm just going to create a local variable for user. And I'm going to go over here, and before I didn't really care how the user was created, but now I'm just going to do a then here. I'm going to get a user, and I'm going to specify user equals this user. By the way, notice I don't need any sort of done here or anything like that. And this is the way that a lot of these, the way that Mocha works, is that if you end up returning a promise from this before each, which user create is, I don't have to put a done here because it's going to wait until this promise ends up getting resolved. But what this allows me to do is then have this user who I'm in effect working with, and I want to make sure that my cart's user ID is equal to the user ID that's here, which it should be. Okay, that's fine. I expect that to actually happen, but let's actually do another test. And the other test that we're going to do here is let's actually nest another post to orders. And what I'm going to end up doing here is what I want to be able to do here is to make sure that I end up returning that same cart, that I don't end up creating two carts for a user. So what I'm going to do here is actually go back up to this post here, and I'm going to end up getting inside here, and I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to put my done in here. Now again, this should end up passing without a problem. which it ends up doing. But what I want to test here, so what I really want to do here is that I want to go over here and I want to say, hey, look, I expect if you ask for a card again, that the ID that you get from the card to equal some card ID. Now, again, I run into the same problem. I don't have this card ID. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to pull out this variable for cart. And I'm going to go over here, and the first time that I end up making this post request, I'm going to get that cart. And I want to test, hey, look, when you end up doing this for a second time, do you end up getting that cart back? And let's see, I expect undefined to equal 1, and let's take a look. Here's our cart. So it's actually, I have this incorrect here, it's going to be response.body, which is going to be the actual cart. And if I go over here and rerun this, I should get something else, which should tell me that my test should end up passing. And let's actually just get it to fail, because you sort of want to go from red to green. And let's modify this so that, in our case, no matter whether or not we end up finding this card or not, what we'll do is, in any case, we'll always end up creating a new cart, which we don't want to do. We want a user only to have one cart. We want only to create the cart if the user doesn't have a cart. So now if we go over here and I rerun this, I should get this to fail, because in fact it's now created two carts for me, and I don't want that to happen. So if you have a cart, I want you to return the cart. Which this ends up doing. So, we are going to want to probably end up creating. So this, I think, works, because what ends up happening is that we're always going to be creating an order from a cart. We're always going to start out as a cart, and we're going to end up moving to an order. So we could even make the case of this being restful, in the sense that when we decide to turn this cart into an order, that'll be a put where we'll end up changing the status. So one thing that I realized that we don't really need here, I'm going to take it out, is that I really don't need to send this status cart. I'm going to take this out. Make sure my tests end up passing. So again, the general way that I've got this architected is that an order is always going to start with a cart, and when we have a logged in user and we end up posting to orders, we're going to get back that user's cart, and it's not going to recreate that cart if that cart ends up existing. Now, notice I have been working on my master branch, and that's kind of something I didn't want to do. So if I do a git.log, I could see that I've got this one commit that's here. What I can end up doing here, if I see git.status, I can see the changes that I have so far. And what I'm going to do here is actually, let's go and see. I'm going to make sure that I have this repo and that I end up posting it. So let me just create this repo, do a little bit of Git here. We'll call this foo store. And I'll create it. And let's go here, and I'm going to push my master branch up. So this will push my master branch, again, without any of these changes that are here, because they don't get pushed up yet. But what I'm going to do is that I don't want to work directly on my master branch, so what I'm going to end up doing here is I'm going to say checkout -b, and I'll say create, and this is going to be my, I'll call it my cart route. Create cart route. And now I'll see I'm within the context of this route, and I could end up adding everything. One thing that I probably want to do here is, instead of pulling out this only, that's not something that I want to have here. So if I made that change and I do git.status, it'll say, well, I have these things here ready to get committed, but you just made a change. So I could do git add again. And now I can say git.commit created a cart route. And at this point, I could say git push to origin create cart route, in which case I've got a new branch, and if I ended up going up here, it would tell me, hey, look, do you want to create a pull request for that branch? And I could go over here and I could see what I ended up adding to the branch. It's pretty clear. Again, code-wise, fairly minimal, right? I ended up adding this order. I have this route, which is pretty... I've got a test, which probably is the majority of my code. The route itself is being pulled in right over here. And the router is making use of this order. Right, so things are separated out nicely. Again, you can sort of follow, the pattern that's in FSG to begin with. But once I do that, what this gives me the ability to do is to go over here and say, yeah, I want to create a pull request. In which case, it's perfectly legitimate right here to merge this pull request. I could confirm the merge. So now this is actually merged up. And, once you're done with that, there's no problem in going ahead and deleting this branch. Okay? Now, again, if I'm working locally and I decide maybe I want to go back, one of the things that I could sort of see here is that possibly some of this work that's happening, one thing that we always want to keep in mind is that, we sort of want our routes to be, as dumb as possible. So maybe there's a little bit too much that's going on here. Maybe this is work that the order should be able to do a little bit more work on its own, and maybe we just tell the order table, hey, look, order, do me a favor, find the cart for this user. Maybe that's a change that we want to make, and we could end up doing it inside of another branch. But one thing that would happen here is if I ended up going back here and I said Git Checkout master, okay? And I went back and I go over here, one of the things that's going to happen is that if I was to go back and look at my models, I would no longer see my order model. Again, if I go back and I switch back to my branch, I can, but really what you want to do here is you want to do a git.pull. So right now, if I do a git .log, I'll see only my current commit. If I see do a git.pull, and now I do a git.log, it'll say, okay, here's your initial commit, here's where you ended up creating your cart route, and here's where we ended up basically merging it in to the master. Okay, let's make a little modification here. What I want to do here is that I'm going to do a git.checkout, and I'm going to say order is responsible for cart. Okay, I'm going to specify the order is going to be responsible for cart. And if I go back over here, if I want to run my tests again, just to make sure that our tests are running, I could end up saying a Gulp test server JS and I'll get my 14 tests to pass. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over here and I'm going to go back to my app and in my routes, and I'm going to simplify things a little bit. So what I'm going to do here is instead of letting my order doing all this work here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, hey, look, do me a favor, order. Get the cart for this user. And in this case, I'm going to get a cart. And I'm going to say response.send cart. I'm going to comment this stuff out. It's going to come in a little bit handy later on. So again, all orders start out as a cart. And in this case, if I go to run this test again, I'm going to get an error because an order does not have a getCart method. So I'll get this error again, 500 error. Again, notice I've never opened up the app at this point in order to make all these changes. That's the kind of nice thing about testing. It's not that you necessarily get done faster, but you know that whatever changes you end up making, you'll know if you ended up causing an error. So here, this is going to be, if we look up here to actually find that error, it's going to be buried in here a little bit, but somewhere up here, I'm going to see order getCart is not a function. So let's actually create that. Let's go back to our database here and our models and our order model. Let's put in a class method. And our class method is going to be getCart. And we're going to pass in a user. And I'm going to literally go in here and I'm going to take a look at the code that I had here. And we'll go back up here and I'll paste this in. Now again, this is in the context of this model. So I could say if this is a class method, I could say this, find one. And if it ends up going in and finding the cart, I'm just going to end up returning the cart. And since I'm in a callback over here, what probably makes a little more sense to do is to actually have a that equals this, because within this callback, the context is going to be different. And I'll say, look, if in fact you were not able to find the cart, then go ahead and create the cart. So now this is no longer request.user ID. This is just user ID. Same thing here. And if we ended up doing that, I'm going to save this, telling me I should have a semicolon here. All right, use some kind of linter. So here's now our class method of getCart. Let's test this out again. And let's just take a look. We've got an internal server error. So let's just take a look and see what it is. So a bit of noise here. Cannot read property then of undefined. And this is, I do this all the time, right? If you ever see that, it just means you're not returning a promise. So now we return a promise. And this should end up passing. Again, you sort of want to go from red to green. So let's make it go from red to green by creating the cart every time. And so our test, which makes sure that you don't create multiple carts for a user through this route, will end up failing, which it does, right? Different IDs. Let's get this to pass. And once this ends up passing, if I do a git.status, I'll see what is actually changed. I've got some files here that are basically a result of my using Vim. Let me remove this file because I don't want this to show up in my repo. Should probably have some git ignore for that. So now I've got these two files. You could also, another couple of commands you could run is git.diff, which will show you the difference. So here, I'm actually asking my order to find cart. And so this is a bit of a win, I think. And let's actually get rid of these comments that we have here too to make this a little bit cleaner. If we go back here, let's take this out. So again, I think this is a win in terms of our router having a little bit less knowledge about how our system works. We tell our order, get a cart, and our order is the one that's responsible for how this works. So theoretically, if we ended up changing how we ended up doing our statuses and that sort of thing. That could be done internally from within this method. So again, the whole idea here is that we just want to have most of our logic, as much logic as we can in our business objects, in our models. So now if we end up doing that, I could see git.diff, right? And this is a little bit better. We've got our logic pushed into our model. And so now at this point, I could say git.add git.commit. Order is responsible for cart. And I could go over here and I could say push to origin. Again, instead of actually pushing it into master here, it's a little bit easier to do it here, a little bit better practice to do it here. I could push. I can now go back over here, and if I go up, it'll tell me, hey, look, you push this thing up. I could go ahead and look at the changes that I made, or someone else could and say, yeah, that looks good. A little bit cleaner here. And so I could say create pull request. I could end up merging this pull request. And again, the only thing that probably makes sense, and again, once you merge it, you don't need this branch. That's already been merged back to master. I can see it on this commit. Here's my commit history. My order is responsible for cart. This ended up getting merged in. And now if I go back to my master, I could just do a pull, and I'll see that I'll end up pulling these changes here. Okay, so that's about the extent of doing some server-side testing. Again, I haven't opened up the app yet. We could talk a little bit about how this would end up getting integrated in the app and how we could end up using it, but I'm going to do that on another video. All right, so I hope you found that helpful.